The first time somebody tried to pick the lock on my garage, I blamed the raccoons. The second time, the one that left shaved metal shavings on the concrete, like a tiny metallic confession, I stopped blaming anything but people. By the third time, I realized they weren't after tools or a TV. They were after a box my wife had guarded for 20 years. And once you know what people are willing to steal for, everything else makes sense. My name's Ethan Cole. I grew up here. I married young. And for 37 years, Lena and I kept a house full of ordinary things that meant everything. A chipped coffee cup she could never throw away, maps she drew on when we planned to get lost, a shed full of fishing rods she'd never touch but insisted we keep, and a little cedar box that lived in my garage like a quiet, stubborn claim on our past. When Lena passed, that box was all the proof I had that she had been more than the lady who baked pies at the neighborhood potlucks. She'd been stubborn in ways that mattered, careful, curious, and quietly furious about small injustices. The box wasn't about treasure, it was about truth. We live in Hollow Creek Commons, pretty as a postcard and tight as a fist. There are white picket fences, community garden rules you could write a book about, and an HOA that treats bylaws like scripture. People here like order, and when someone like Margaret Hale gets to read the rules out loud with the calm of a judge, people fall in line. Margaret was polished, trim, the kind of woman who could smile while deciding which neighbor got a warning that week. She had a way of making the community trust her. She hosted bake sales and school fundraisers. She ran the meetings. She knew every blade of grass in the common lawn. What we didn't know was how fast that smile could turn professional when something worth shaking a few people down for came into play. It started small, a polite note about a maintenance issue that was not maintenance at all, a clipboard, and an inspection that suddenly found something wrong with Lena's old storage shed. Margaret was always around with a pen and a chat, asking questions about my late wife's hobbies and making casual notes about household items of concern. I chalked it up to grief, to prying neighbors. I was a man trying to get by on mornings that would never feel the same again. I had no energy for paranoia. Then I found the photos. Someone had taken close-ups of the lock on the cedar box, had photographed the grain of the wood and the tiny scrawl Lena made on a scrap of paper, and then posted a picture of our little driveway on a private forum I didn't belong to. I recognized the angle, someone who knew how to move in and around a neighborhood without drawing attention. The message under the pictures was polite, clinical. If the owner is unwilling to comply, HOA will proceed with removal per covenant 4.3. That's the thing about covenants, they're like a thin legal blanket until a hand reaches under it and starts taking things. When acid stains showed up on the lid of the box, little etched marks that smelled of metal and carelessness, I stopped sleeping. Lena had been a quiet student of details. She taught herself to patch quilts, to decode old deeds, to catalog church records for hours on end. Her notebooks were full of precise handwriting, names and dates and fingers that never seemed to stop following a thread. Once in a while she would mutter about irregularities in our small town, a deed here that didn't line up, a parking lot that belonged to one family, but everyone used it. I thought it was the habit of people who had grown used to noticing. I had no idea it would pull a wire through enough hands to shock half the county. When I say they, I mean people who saw an opportunity. Margaret and her inner circle, a small, quietly efficient group of board members and volunteers, had started, over the years, to convert civic control into leverage. They had sway over permits, over who got lawn maintenance contracts, over the way minor fines rolled into serious pressure. Some of them had side businesses that always seemed to win community contracts. The pattern was subtle, and that's the point. It's easier to claim competence than malice, and most of us preferred the story of Margaret the efficient volunteer to Margaret the calculated predator. It was Ivy Morales who finally knocked on my door with something that smelled like courage. Ivy was the HOA secretary, soft-voiced and nervous, the kind of woman people overlooked until they realized she knew everything. She'd been collecting small pieces of evidence and stuffing them under her pillow like someone saving coins for a rainy day. She didn't come to sell me gossip. She came because Lena's name kept coming up in things she couldn't dry clean away. "You don't have to get dragged through this, Ethan," she said, hands shaking so hard she spilled coffee on her sleeve. "But I can't keep holding this alone." Lena, she knew. She kept notes about the parking lot deeds. She said something about a ledger. I thought it was just fussing. But then the contractors come and you see the invoices, and one company bids, the same company wins. It's small at first, small checks, favors. Then a letter here, a notarized thing there. And before you know it, there are shell transfers through someone in another state. Ivy had a voice that made you want to believe her and a nervous look that told you she was terrified of being wrong. She'd been compiling receipts and emails, screenshots of meeting minutes that forgot to include key votes, and bank transfers that traced like a faint, crooked creek. She urged me to talk to my son, Daniel, who was not my blood but close enough he'd switched careers a few years back, moved into law enforcement, and for the first time in months, I felt like maybe someone could translate the weight of Lena's notebooks into a language that mattered. Daniel was practical. He came the next morning with a travel mug and a look that said he thought grief was for later, when practical things had been handled. "Dad," he said, flipping through Lena's notebooks on the kitchen table, "this isn't just a neighbor feud. These are documents. There's a pattern here that points to coordinated activity. There are lease assignments, false contractor bids, and here's a wire transfer to a shell company with an address in a P.O. box 2 towns over. This is not HOA petty cash. This is an operation. The middle act of our lives, the one most people keep private, is often the part where you either hand over your story or fight for it. I decided to fight. We didn't immediately call the feds. That felt like pulling a thread and risking the whole sweater coming apart in front of us. We started in our teeth and our shoulders. We organized the documents. We marked dates. We made copies. And for the first time since Lena's funeral, I felt the steady rhythm of purpose. Lena's notebooks were a map, names, dates, oddities. She had written down a meeting where a common easement was quietly sold for a fraction of its value, noting who signed it and under what pretense. She had records of how a supposedly community benefit landscaping company got 3 times the bids, but somehow won every contract. It was all small, legal-sounding stuff that when threaded together looked like a net tightening slowly. Ivy provided inside access and a spreadsheet she had kept since the start of the year. Daniel talked to an old colleague who'd become a federal investigator special agent Reed. Reed had seen cases like this before. Civic authority turned into money and power, the kind of thing that rots neighborhoods from the inside out. He listened, asked for dates, and his voice when he said, "We can open something," made the room feel both safer and terrifying at once. You don't go after people like Margaret Hale with a scream. You go after them with patience and a chain of custody. We set traps that were paper deep and legal thick, evidence requests, FOIA filings, polite but official letters asking for bid histories. You know how a neighborhood meeting everyone brings coffee and opinions in 90 seconds per item. We started attending board meetings and quietly taking notes. Margaret still smiled. She always smiled when people called her reasonable. And yet, even with the feds quietly at work, the pressure on my garage increased. There was an attempted break-in one night, muffled footsteps, a soft scrape, a flashlight beam that made the cap bolt under Lena's old table. They were professionals, the kind who knew the exact feel of a padlock and how to leave little things undone so as to threaten rather than take. A note arrived in my mailbox the next day, typed, formal. Pursuant to Covenant 4.3, the HOA reserves the right to remove items not in compliance with subordinate guidelines. It was signed by the board secretary and stamped with a slit of authority. The way Margaret spoke in public was always different from the way she spoke privately. In public, she was measured. We act in the community's best interest. Privately, when we cornered her at a meeting once with a friendlier board member present, she let a different face show sharp, almost hungry. "Lena's box," she said, smiling thinly. "We are merely enforcing covenants. If something belongs to the common area or violates the terms, we remove it. It's civil. It's clean." Her hand tapped a pen, slow and precise. "It's not common property," I said. My voice sounded like a stranger's in my ears. "Oh, Ethan," she replied, with that small, practiced pity. "Sometimes people are sentimental. Sentiment doesn't trump community safety. We're only stewards." It was the word stewards that made me speak more sharply than I meant to. "Stewards don't act like thieves, Margaret." She cocked her head as if pity had weight. "Watch your language, Mr. Cole. We are accountable to the homeowners." We were pushing on a thing that was smooth for everyone else. Outwardly, the HOA's rules were plausible. Inwardly, they were the lever. There were meetings recorded with convenient omissions, contracts awarded to companies with close ties to the board, payments routed through LLCs registered to P.O. boxes. Lena had written names next to each suspicious line, and she had written a note with a little smiley face that made me laugh and sob at the same time. If something happens to me, Ethan, follow the crumbs. We followed the crumbs. There was a night when the cedar box went missing. My heart did something old and animal and uncontrollable. I searched the garage with a flashlight, ran my hands over every shelf, moved boxes like someone trying to find lost bones, and then I saw the lock, snapped off, lying on the floor like a small severed history. Someone had been in there. Someone had wanted to keep their hands clean of the deed. That's when things got ugly in ways the newspapers like to call escalation. There were attempts to intimidate people who had been quiet contractors who had second thoughts found their bids mysteriously rejected the next week. A gardener who tried to testify got a nasty fine for unlicensed activity. Ivy started getting anonymous emails threatening exposure of her personal information. I got a card with a single typed line, "We will not be bullied." It was the kind of line that reads polite in type, but is coiled like a wire underneath. Daniel, who had always been practical about things, leaned over a stack of copies and looked at me the night we decided to go public. "Dad," he said, "you can do this the hard way, press charges. Go to the press, or you can do it the steady way. Let the feds move. We protect chain of custody. We keep Lena's notes intact. We make sure we don't give them a reason to say it's hearsay. We let Special Agent Reed move. They executed subpoenas, called in forensic accountants, and for a few weeks our lives were filled with men and women in plain suits who had a patience that felt like armor. They traced payments to shell companies, to a landscaping firm that never actually did work, and to a property management corporation registered under a name that matched Margaret's sister-in-law's middle name. There were enough dots once you connected them that even the most careful denier would have to squint to see another story. Margaret's reaction was textbook and theatrical. She held meetings where she spoke about transparency and community care with the sort of righteous cadence that has kept countless people in power for decades. She looked hurt in those moments, and several neighbors came up to give her their sympathy. In private, we started getting more direct threats. Our tires slashed, a rock through the window of the community center, and once, a man in a big truck following me home from the store until I pulled into the church parking lot, and he sped away. Someone, a board member we later found out took payment in cash, tried to buy my silence with a card and a check for a sum that would have bought me half a year's groceries. I kept it and put it in Lena's box when the box was returned, which it was, mysteriously, one Sunday morning, left under the weeping willow like an offering and a threat in one package. When the feds moved in for arrests, it felt like a winter morning. There is a crystalline moment when big things change. Agents in plain clothes at the HOA meeting, a man in a suit reading a list of charges, neighbors standing in doorways watching their own lives as if the movie had quietly shifted genres. Margaret was cuffed in her own community center, hands steady as a conductor, mouth forming words that were thin and indignant. "This is political," she said into a camera with practiced outrage. "This is a vendetta against volunteers." The trials are a blur in memory testimony, ledgers, the sound of a judge calling order, a cassette playback of a recording Lena had made where she, in her small, precise voice, listed the names and numbers and the way things didn't line up. There was a moment when the prosecution played a recording of a board meeting where Margaret and a contractor discussed pushing a contract through quietly because the paperwork was too messy for public scrutiny, a line that landed in the courtroom like a dropped stone. The jury watched, and in their faces I saw the slow, inevitable turn of understanding. Lena's recorded message was the thing that made it feel like a private pact fulfilled. She had recorded a voice note a few months before she died, a little clipped, like she had rehearsed the cadence in her head. "Ethan," she said, "if you're listening to this, it's because I either didn't get to finish or I made you promise to keep going. There are names and dates and invoices. I wrote what I could while I could. Don't let them call it small. Small is where the rot starts." When the verdicts came, Margaret got more than house arrest. She got a sentence that had the sound of consequence, restitution, community service, and most importantly to me, a public order to return funds and resign from any community posts for a decade. Some of her closest accomplices were ordered to repay money, to forfeit property, and one of them a man who had used the HOA to secure a little lakeside lot that had never been for sale, lost land, he had been quietly reassigning for years. The judge used language that sounded like a public scolding. The abuse of community trust is a grave betrayal. It was legal literature that felt like a moral sentence, too. Winning does odd things to a person. It doesn't unfurl grief. The mornings are still the mornings, and Lena's chair still collects dust in a way that feels exactly like a memory sitting in the house. But there was a repair, slow and precise, that followed conviction. The HOA board was dissolved and reformed under federal oversight for a year. Contracts were put out to bid honestly. A community fund was created to support victims of predatory civic behavior, and the signage that once lopped our common lawn in two was reprinted with a clause about transparency that felt like a bandage stitched on properly. There were complications. Some neighborhood friendships never came back. People who'd been complicit out of fear moved away, and others stayed and had to face what they'd let happen. The debate in Hollow Creek Commons turned into something public, heated letters to editors, town hall meetings where people argued about how much power an HOA should have, and articles that called us a case study in small-town corruption and then shifted attention elsewhere. That was, in some ways, the point. Once you shine a light in a place, it no longer fits the same. And then the part that people always want to skip to, the cinematic image of retribution, happened in public in a way that felt almost too clean. Margaret had a moment in the community center, right before she was taken away, when she looked at me across a room full of people and said, "You could have had this piece back, Ethan. People need strong hands." She was smiling like she had for years, the smile that had guided meetings and bought votes. I stood up, and maybe I shouldn't have, but something in me wanted that line to have consequences. I walked toward her, slow, and I said, "Strong hands don't steal from their neighbors." She laughed, small and brittle. "Speaking as a widow," she said, "you know better than most how sentiment clouds judgment." There was applause from some corners, and a man's voice from the back that said, "You're finally getting what you deserve." It was ugly and righteous all at once. Margaret looked at the faces she had manipulated for years, and finally on her own the truth of the fracture showed in her eyes. People love the end because endings fit on a page, but justice is rarely tidy. The open-ended part of our story, the one that made people argue in comments and in church basements, was whether we had struck a blow for the community or whether we'd merely replaced one kind of control with another. There were neighbors who said we should have let things go, that community harmony was worth more than exposing every ugly detail. Others said silence is complicity. I don't have a tidy sermon. I have a house with Lena's quilts folded on the couch, a son who meets me for coffee and doesn't talk about heroics, and a neighborhood that will probably, tomorrow, accuse another neighbor of something petty and ugly. I have days where I think maybe we made the place safer, and nights where I wonder if we'll simply find a new Margaret in 5 years with a better smile and quieter hands. That's how these things go. If I had to say one thing clearly, and I wish I could say it more eloquently than the legal documents did, it's that community power matters, and the way it's exercised matters more. People who volunteer to steward common space are given a kind of quiet authority we rarely question, and that quiet is a perfect cover for those who organize to profit. You don't need to be greedy to be dangerous. You just need to be comfortable enough in your power to bend rules in ways that look small until they're not. Lena understood details the way other people understand sunsets. She believed small things could point to big things. She believed in following names and dates and paper trails because she trusted that truth outlived cleverness. The cedar box in the garage was never about revenge. It was about keeping a record so when the time came someone would have to look at the facts and not at the rumor. If grief made me slow, her notebooks made me steady. If you're watching this, if you live in a place with rules and a board and people who organize bake sales and meetings, look closer than you think is polite. Ask who benefits from decisions. Ask for bids. Ask who signs checks and whether those people are related to anyone who gets the work. It's not meddling, it's stewardship in the right sense. And if you find something, don't assume you're the only one. Keep notes. Take pictures. Find the person who is brave enough to write down what they saw, and then believe them until you have a reason not to. I won't pretend I enjoy the fight. I don't. But I will say this in closing. There is a deep, stubborn pleasure in watching something wrong be made right, even if the right is not perfect. There is a small joy in the neighborhood garden where neighbors who were afraid to speak now meet and talk like neighbors again. and there is a stubborn ache that never leaves me from losing Lena. Both things can be true at once. So tell me, what would you have done? Would you have kept your head down and your box shut? Or would you have followed the crumbs like Lena told me to? Do you think community rules are a shield or a sword? Drop a comment if you live in a place run by an HOA, or if you've ever felt the sting of small power abuses. Share your story, or just tell me what you think justice looks like in a small town. If you like this kind of true feeling story, subscribe for more that dig into ordinary people doing extraordinary, slow work. And if you're on the fence, ask yourself whether the quiet nights on your street are held together by kindness or by fear, and if it's fear, who benefits from keeping it that way?